Hi, thank you very much for waiting. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it very much. Thank you to Steve. And let's just begin. I'm sort of still kind of under the influence of that film as a mother of two little boys. I was listening to the Prime Minister, and I was listening to the French Ambassador, and to the other ministers who came here this morning. And it reminded me, everybody talking and sharing the same perspective on the massacres in Paris on Friday night, that this was an attack against us all, that this was an attack on humanity, on civilization, and unfortunately a direct attack on all of the people who were massacred, going about their lives in Paris, and what it really means, the kind of toll that terrorism takes. And I have to admit that lurking in the back of my mind, and I think in the back of a lot of Israelis' mind, was a lingering question that has bothered us each time there were mass terror attacks, beginning perhaps in Madrid, London, in 2005, and ever since, which is, do they get it now? Do they understand? Here we are, the nation of Israel, so many of us putting the tricolor on our Facebook pages, and thousands of Israelis participating in vigils and in really sort of these ceremonies where we come together to express our revulsion at what happened to the young people in Paris on Friday night. And the question always lurking in our brains, even if we don't mention it out loud, is, do they get it? Do they understand? In fact, the day that the terrorist bombings took place in London in 2005, I wrote a column for the Jerusalem Post that appeared the next day, which I called An Attack on Us All, an attack against us all. And in it, I described how the British governments had been acting in a very clear way from a political perspective under Tony Blair and subsequent to that, to make a distinction between Palestinian terrorism against Israel and terrorism against the rest of the world, and Islamic terrorism against the rest of the world. And wondering whether, now that they have suffered the same fate as Israelis suffer every day, whether they would finally understand that terrorism, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said, is indivisible. Well, a decade passed since those terrorist bombings in London, and the distinction that Europeans in particular make on the ground, regardless of their declarations immediately after terrorist bombings, between the murder of Israelis at the hands of Palestinian terrorists and the murder of foreigners at the hands of terrorists, has only grown. The discrimination against Israel, the hands particularly of Europeans, and the distinction that they make between Israel and their countries and the rest of the countries of the world, has only been exacerbated, has only escalated, has only grown much worse. And I think that in the question itself is a hope that the discrimination that Israelis have experienced at the hand particularly of European governments, that discrimination is based on a lack of awareness, on an ignorance of what's happening, of the ignorance of what jihad is, and an ignorance of what it is that fuels terrorism. But unfortunately, and that as a result, once that ignorance is rectified, once people learn for themselves what it means, they will treat us in the same manner with which they would like us and expect us to treat them, and the way that they treat one another. Unfortunately, the reason why that never happens is because the distinct relationship that they have with Israel, the distinct way that they have of treating us, is not based upon a lack of experience. It's prejudice, not facts, that stand at the heart of the bum deal that Israel has repeatedly received from Europe. It's because of facts, and when the facts don't match that prejudice, we see here on the ground every day, and we have with increasing urgency or expansiveness on every single day that Europe is spending millions of euros every single year, year in, year out, funding anti-Israel organizations here, registered as non-governmental organizations, whose task is to distort facts or invent facts in order to align with the prejudicial view that Europeans hold of Israel. We don't abuse human rights. We don't break international law. And yet we see an army of NGOs every single day putting out more and more reports claiming the opposite is true, claiming that black is white and white is black. Now, why is this? It's because that action on the part of the governments of Europe, the funding of these lies, of this distortion of reality, advances a policy that we never hear discussed openly, but is clear as day, which is to discriminate against the Jewish state in order to weaken and harm it. And again, Israel enacts this policy by using legal forums, trade forums, and political forums. Today, we are in the midst of Europe's trade war against Israel. The war itself, the existence of this trade war that Europe is waging against us is hidden. It's never acknowledged. It is hidden by lies about international law, lies about consumer protection, and lies about human rights. But the war itself is a breach of international law. It doesn't protect consumers, and it harms human rights. The EU's new labeling guidelines for Israeli products produced beyond the 1949s are precisely what they appear to be. They are a new set of rules that apply only to the Jewish state and to our detriment. That's all. They do not exist for anybody else, only for Israel. Now, what do these labels say? Do they say product of the West Bank? No. Do they say product of Judea and Samaria? No. They say that products produced beyond the 1949 armistice lines by Jews are products of Israeli settlements. Not same labels that they use for products produced by non-Jews in those areas, only Jews. And the interesting thing is both the distinctiveness of the labeling and the fact that it isn't only the place of origin, but who produces them. Now, European officials argue that the purpose of these labels is not to harm Israel, but simply to protect consumers. But if they aren't directed against Israel, then it isn't possible to argue that consumers have been harmed by the use of the labels made in Israel. And if consumers have been harmed by the fact that Israeli products produced beyond the 1949 armistice lines have been labeled to date made in Israel, then that means that this is a policy that's directed against Israel. That Israel has been doing something wrong for which it must be punished, because apparently the Europeans believe that if consumers aren't told that Israelis operating beyond the 1949 armistice lines are producing these products, then they won't know not to buy them. And what they have to learn is not to buy them, and therefore they're told not only that it's made in the West Bank, not only that it's made in Judea and Samaria, but it's made by Israelis. Now, the Europeans, including the Honorable Ambassador to the UN, who will speak after me, argue that these aren't substantive issues. They are technical issues. And they're right. They are technical issues. They are technical barriers to trade, and as such, they are illegal under international law. Under the WTO treaties, it is illegal to introduce technical barriers to trade among trading partners, signatory nations of the WTO projects. Now, if they want to continue with these labels and not be in breach of binding international law, then they can leave the WTO. Or, alternatively, they can remain in the WTO and use the same labels against everybody in the same legal situation. Meaning, for instance, that instead of insisting that products produced in Western Sahara are produced in Morocco, they will label that they are settlement products. They are Moroccan settlement products from Western Sahara. Now, they're not going to pull out of the WTO, and they're not going to apply this new rule equitably across the board to everybody because they don't care about this issue when it applies to anybody else. They only care about it in regards to Israel because their policy towards Israel, again, is to discriminate against Israel in order to harm it. Now, this isn't the first time that this has happened to us. This isn't the first time that we have been singled out for unique treatment by the Europeans, and it won't be the last one. But we have to understand that it isn't simply a question of wanting to make it about technical issues. This is part and parcel of an overall policy whose purpose is to harm the Jewish state. And why do they want to harm us? Because they don't want to treat us the same way that they treat everybody else. They don't think that we deserve to be treated the same way as every other country in the world, let alone every other liberal democracy in the world. And given this harsh reality, we need to think about changing the way that we treat and relate towards Europe. We have to look at Europe the same way, more or less, that the United States looks at China. That is, they are our trading partner, we share some common interests with them, but overall, we're rivals. We're rivals. They have a policy that is to harm us, and we have a policy goal of not being harmed. That makes us rivals. Now, it's true that Europe is bigger than Israel. They can bully us in all sorts of ways. But there are some things that we can do to protect ourselves, and we should. First of all, we should stop giving the EU legal immunity for its illegal actions. We should sue the EU against its illegal technical barriers to trade at the WTO tribunal. We should sue them. Second, we should stop providing automatic visas for personnel in the European consulates general in Jerusalem. These are not diplomatic legations that are accredited by the government of Israel, and as a result, the government of Israel has no reason to provide the same treatment towards these consulates that we provide everywhere else, particularly since these consulates are the epicenter of the EU's political, diplomatic, and political trade war against us. We have to, as well, take our response, our initial response, to the imposition of these labeling requirements last week, which was to suspend our diplomatic dialogue with the Europeans in relation to the Palestinians. We should make it permanent, or at least we should make it contingent on the canceling of these labels. So long as these labels remain in effect, the Europeans should have no place at the table. And here it's important to note just how dramatically negative the impact of these labels are on the prospects for peace. After all, the Palestinians say that they're insufficient, and we understand that they are discriminatory, and therefore there's no way that by taking these actions, the Europeans are promoting the cause of peace. To the contrary, they're harming it. As to the NGOs, not only should we do what the Knesset is now debating doing, which is requiring them to note on all their publications that they are funded by foreign governments, but we should deny them tax breaks that they receive, which are effective subsidies by Israeli taxpayers of their actions against us, funded by foreign governments whose purpose is to undermine our ability to govern ourselves. NGOs should no longer be the beneficiaries, and NGOs that are funded by foreign governments should no longer be the beneficiaries of tax breaks from the Israeli taxpayers. Then there's the European forces that are operating here, specifically the temporary so-called international presence in Hebron. That was an international force of monitors that was put together in 1994 following Baruch Goldstein's massacre of worshipers in the Cave of the Patriarchs. TIP, at this point, doesn't serve any purpose in terms of protecting either the Muslims or the Jews of Hebron. Basically, its job is to attack Israel, and as such, there's no national interest that is advanced by its continued deployment. They only are deployed there because twice a year, Israel approves a continuation of their mandate. We should not continue to approve the continuation of their mandate when the current 6-month period of their operations comes due. It should end. Finally, the Europeans are able to enact their discriminatory labeling of Israeli products because we have given them our postal code so that they can distinguish between Israeli, Jewish, and non-Israeli products produced beyond the 1949 armistice lines. They've used the postal codes that we've given them to bad ends not intended by Israel when we transferred them to them during the free trade negotiations in 2005. And as a consequence, and given the discriminatory use that they're making of our postal codes, we should stop placing postal codes of the producers of export products to Europe on our export documents. They should not be benefiting from the fact that we gave them information assuming that they weren't going to use it to discriminate us, when in fact they are using it to discriminate us. Now, here we have to just understand that this doesn't mean that we don't care about Europe. And it doesn't mean that we don't truly, honestly, and to the bottom of our heart, feel their pain when they're massacred the same way we are by the same people who have the same goal of forming a global caliphate and destroying Western civilization. We care about them deeply, and we wish them all the success, and we should help them any way we can, because these are areas where we have the same interests and the same values, which is why we would have expected better treatment from them on other issues. God should protect the Europeans from the jihadists and bless the memories of those who were murdered in Paris, killed by our common enemies. But the fact that we care about the Europeans doesn't mean that their governments and their elites have our best interests at heart. We do. And they won't, because time and experience has shown that they don't learn, because their position against us is not based on fact, it is based on prejudice, and we should not be rewarding that prejudice ever again. We are here for them. We'll be happy to stand with them in our common fights. But where our common goals do not intersect, we have to stand by our interests and stand against those who discriminate against us because we are the Jewish state, and not allow them a foothold in our decision-making about things about which we have no common interest. So I thank you all very much, and I look forward to continued trade with Europe and good relations where they're possible, and I look forward to our leaders challenging the Europeans on the things that they have done to harm us. Thank you very much.